known to do in my past. So this is, as Stephen mentioned, a homecoming for me. This is my graduation picture. I am a lot less serious than I am now. I'm joined here today. My mom is here, who had to deal with this serious guy, and Professor Gary Schwartz, who was pretty much my mentor during this bit here. So I'm raised in the Bronx. I went to BCC for a year. Spent my time there wandering through the library, the Hall of Fame, et cetera. Here at Lehman, I tried to avoid dying in the tunnel and trying to avoid at all times the cafeteria. From that, I went to Cambridge on a Marshall Scholarship, and I remember it was a few months after this picture was taken. I'm now standing in front of King's College, Cambridge, right? This kid from the South Bronx, too many bags, not enough books. And I have no idea what I'm going to do. And then it hits me, like, I'm from the Bronx. If I can get across Fordham Road on a Saturday afternoon, Cambridge is gonna be okay. I also went a few places after that. So this is a homecoming. I'm very happy to be here. I did wander around earlier to see what has changed. Note, I did not put my graduation year here because I'm feeling a little old today. So just briefly, what we do, the organization that I work for is called NRCC2A, which is pretty much the box on the smallest circle on the far left that's there. We work with college students, we work with institutions, et cetera. But essentially what we do as part of our tech research is a little bit different than what you would see in analyst firms. Some analyst firms will tell you market sizing, market trends, X company is growing, X company is not growing, and we say, yes, that's fine. But what we really want to do is ensure that institutions and vendors are thinking about how technology furthers goals, some of which the previous speaker had just mentioned. How does it further goals? How does it really move the needle? I came out of K-12. I've designed solutions, I've implemented solutions, and I have no idea whether any of them were successful. I know they worked. I know they were within budget and time and scope. I know all of that, but I have no idea if the state or school district was any better for this thing existing. We want to kind of push that aside a little bit in higher ed. So we take a different tack than some of our other colleagues out there in the analyst world. So I'm going to talk about what I call future-proofing, and it's going to be in two parts. Some of it will overlap with the previous speaker, and I'm sorry about that. It will be the problem space and the solution space. And we're going to talk about some of the problems that are there. The particular viewpoint I'm taking here is about how it impacts technology, okay? How we have to think about the role of technology and all of that. This thing you see here, I'm in the process of revising for this year. Please don't try to read it. I don't want to have to pay for Advil and headaches for everyone here. But essentially, it tries to capture in a taxonomy all of the technology in higher ed, right? That's essentially what we've done. And on this chart, you can see it's noisy, right? If an institution says, I want to get a solution, and they have to parse through all of these different logos, which some do, right? That's going to give you nightmares, right? That is not an easy thing to do. So the first thing is, the problem space is, the marketplace is noisy. A lot of vendors out there say they promote student success. I'm like, you are a key card system. You do not promote student success. You help students get into buildings, but that's all you really do. It's not a student success tool in the same way as maybe an analytics tool is. So everyone's marketing, they're trying to make sure they speak the language that you speak, they answer some of the charges of procurement, and there's this motion, and we say, no, actually, that's not true. You are this or you are that, and we want to classify it accordingly. But the noisy marketplace is a fact. The second is the changing landscape. So we see three big things, in addition to economics, financial aid, debt, demographics, but we see, like, thinking about technology, right? We know it's changing. If you go to a technology conference, if you took a shot of whiskey every time someone said blockchain, you'd be drunk in about an hour. But if you took a shot every time someone explained what blockchain was, you'd be sober throughout the rest of the day. But we know the technology is changing. We know there's a lot of movement there. New things are coming in. Some of it's still nascent, but nonetheless. Teaching is another area. Someone mentioned CBE, pedagogical models. flipped classrooms, et cetera. Students, requirements of personalization, 24/7 access to equipment. And these are sort of changes that are happening in the landscape surrounding just the technology portion. Then this is something I hear a lot. When you go to a conference and you say, student success, everyone says student success, and you say, well, what do you mean by student success? You're gonna get, within every 5 people, you probably get like 8 or 9 definitions, okay? Because no one's really clear. Do we mean, for example, persistence to graduation? Is that what we mean? That's the predominant one, that's the one that's most prevalent in the national discourse, but is that what we mean? Do we mean career advancement, employability? Is that what we mean? Okay? Do we mean something that we tell our children all the time, go off, be better, grow up, et cetera, holistic, right, development? Or do we mean academic grades? There are others, including one that CUNY is very well known for, which is social mobility, moving up the classes, right? This is something that I'm very proud to be a graduate of a place that really focuses on that, right? Is that what we mean by student success? And also, what are the drivers for student success? Are we talking about we're doing it to prove value? And this is something that's very big. We talked a little bit about boot camp, but this idea of institutions have to justify their existence. This is why we're important, okay? Or is it some external pressure, accreditation, right? Or is it recruitment? Or is it just some sense of, I want to be a student success focused institution because that helps the public good, some sort of do-we-ask approach, right? But often, student success is ill-defined. The drivers for student success are ill-defined. So when it comes to technology solutions that promote student success, how would you know that? Your target is fuzzy. Another pressure which comes up quite a lot is the partnership between IT and the rest of the institution, okay? More often than not, institutions we talk to, IT is stuck at the bottom. It's about making things work. It's plumbing, right? It's making your value is binary, either works or it doesn't work, okay? As you want to move up and become more transformative, you have to think in partnership with IT. Both sides, okay, what we call business and IT, have to work together to make that happen. And that S-curve is the growth pattern, and you have to get to a point where you're really thinking beyond whether it works or whether it doesn't work, and to whether it's really helping us become the institution we want to become, to realize our vision, et cetera. I just recently spoke to an institution that developed a strategic plan, and they were very proud of it, and I interviewed 23 of their staff. No one mentioned the strategic plan, right? Not a single person. Everyone said, well, we're going to do this thing, and this is the key thing, and we're going to improve the network infrastructure. That's definite. And you're like, well, what? How does that relate to the strategic plan? Like, I don't know. I never bothered to think about it. Okay, it was not a factor at all. Strategic plan was something that sat there, externally facing, for the board, for funders, et cetera, but it never trickled down in a way that can be partnered with IT to help the institution become what it wants to become. Another thing we hear is what's called student life cycle, right? So people talk about it, they say, okay, students progress on this trajectory, right? And it's this nice thing where each of these dots, this is the Seattle train station, but each of these dots represents some key point, right? Admissions, selection of courses, et cetera. And we say, okay, this is what students experience in higher ed. And that's actually not not true at all. Because really, it's closer to this, right? There are delays, there are things broken down, there are switched tracks, students have to do. So one question for IT right now is, how do you support students along this journey? How do you make sure that your technology is aligned to identify problems students may be facing, roadblocks, et cetera, and to help them overcome them and show them what next steps they can take and what next steps you should take to do it. But because we're still stuck, a lot of it in higher ed, on this single trajectory view, we're not really thinking about the world that I was in, the world that your students are actually in all the time. I saw some of them. I see you are doing some wonderful stuff with helping with healthcare and wellness, et cetera, as they move along this crazy journey. So this thing is something I got from University of Birmingham in the UK, and it is intended to be insane. They were trying to map their technology to their processes. The technologies are in the center, the processes are in yellow on the top and bottom. And they found that this is what their ecosystem looked like. They had lines all over the place, right? And we can see the causes of that, right? Someone bought something and didn't consult with someone else, so now there's a bit of an overlap, right? Or someone bought something that superseded something, but they didn't get rid of the first thing, right? So we've seen this quite a lot, but this is the result of when you don't think about furthering goals, you don't think about really student journey, that kind of thing, and you don't recognize some of the changes in the landscape around teaching, learning, technology, in addition to the challenges mentioned earlier. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the solution space, like how we're going to, what are the steps to kind of future-proof your technology ecosystem and your university so that you don't do this, right? I'm giving my age away with this yet again, but I'm a huge, huge fan of Wile E. Coyote. See, get it? Wiley. This was something that was really interesting to me. But anyway, so that we don't end up doing this, how do we avoid that trap? So what does future-proofing mean? It's an often used term, but basically I define it as having three big components. The first is having an ecosystem that is flexible. It can respond to change over time. You're not locked into one thing, one approach, one pattern, architectural pattern. The other is maintainability over time. All technology has to respond to your evolution as you grow. It has to grow with you, right? I tell a lot of vendors, technology asks as many questions of users as users ask of technology, right? You have to evolve with them over time. We call that maintainability. The also is the unknown, right? You don't know what's going on. You don't know if you're going to launch a CBE program, if it's going to be online. You have no idea, but you want to set yourself up in such a way that you can pivot different ways if need be. So this is what I mean by future-proofing. And in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about how we can go about, how you might consider going about future-proofing your technology ecosystem at your different institutions. Remember the crazy logo? You'd probably be burned in the back of your retina for some time, the crazy logo-filled map that was up there. We get institutions saying, hey, there's 6 logos in here. Which company should I contract with? We say, that's interesting, but wrong approach, right? That's a product level approach, where you're thinking about products from a feature functionality point of view. That's it, right? That gets you so far. It's important, but it only gets you so far. What's more important is if you start thinking about it from a strategic point of view. When you start thinking about it as, well, how does it help me 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Looking at the strategic plan that I've now just dusted off, how does it help me further those goals? That's the way to look at it. So we're seeing institutions shift here, and it's not just the big names, the MITs, et cetera. We're seeing smaller institutions beginning to shift in their thinking. I'm not going to just acquire something at the product level. I'm going to acquire it because it's strategic or it helps me with my strategy. And we call the first one the phone view, right? So when we buy a phone, we say, okay, we want it to have better memory, a nice camera. My last one sucked, so it can't do the same thing as the last one. So that's where we go, right? We think of it as the product level view. We think of it as we're buying a phone. But really, it's close to this. And please excuse, this is the only logo of marriage I could find. So I'm not being normative in any way. It's the only logo I could find. But in any case, it's more of that kind of partnership, right? You have to work with the vendor. You have to work with the piece of technology. It's more like a marriage. It's less like buying a phone. So we counsel and advise institutions to move away from the product view and think more of the strategy point of view. What's interesting as a result of that is now they have to talk to somebody else, right? Now you're on the phone or you're in a room with the provost, the VP of Student Success, the head of advising. It's a different conversation. The product view you could pretty much make on your own, but this view requires that you now have to have partnerships. You cross organizational silos. And we think you have a greater chance of success when that actually happens. Another thing we're advising institutions to do is kind of think about an ecosystem. Most often, when people talk about an ecosystem, they're talking about a collection of technology, and we say that's wrong. An ecosystem is an interaction, right? Between users, services, technology, et cetera. And here is an example, and I'll just walk through what this is, a teaching and learning ecosystem. So the first, you have to, at the very top, you have to think about the roles, and that's been changing. Remember the old learning management systems? How many people out there remember them, right? They were really just designed for the instructor, right? The instructor had all the content, et cetera. That's changing. The students' agency when it comes to teaching and learning is changing. So the roles of a technology, of a teaching and learning ecosystem are changing. Another thing is presentation, how people get the data, right? It is now mobile and tablet as well as desktop, laptop. Here's something we'll talk a little bit more about later called principles, right? These are sort of guiding values that govern and constrain your technology ecosystem, right? They may include things like privacy and security, which everyone wants. No one says, no, I'm good. I don't really want my data to be private or secure. But they may also include other things, like I want to use data as an enterprise asset, right? Meaning it's usable across everyone, across all campus, and of course it's understandable across the entire campus. But there are principles here. This is an area that is usually overlooked. This is where lifelong learning sits. If lifelong learning is your principle, your whole ecosystem looks different. Okay? It looks just much different. You now have to bring in data that's external to you in information. You have to think about student portability of data. The student can take data with her. It's much different if one of your principles is promoting lifelong learning. The educational activity, educational content, we read about a lot. The activity is the instructional models, the pedagogical approach, et cetera. The content will be videos, electronic portfolios, et cetera. And then analytics. I gave an interview yesterday to the Heshinger report, actually, around analytics and how crazy a market that is, particularly since everyone says they're doing predictive analytics, when I don't think that many of them are actually doing predictive analytics. And then the common services. You have to think about what else do I need? One thing often overlooked is authentication and authorization, right? Users can log in, and they can only see what they're authorized to see, okay? And trying to manage that across an entire ecosystem is fun, right? It's exciting. We can all wear our Microsoft Active Directory shirts and cry ourselves to sleep at night, because it's actually not terribly great. And then the last thing are the actual solutions, the technology. But we see institutions skip 1 through 7 and say, okay, my technology ecosystem is going to be just about solutions, so I will need an analytics solution, I will need a learning management system, I will need an adaptive learning solution. I'm like, how do you know that's what you need if you haven't thought through the roles, presentation, principles, who's doing what are they doing it with, how does it have to interact with everything else? How do you know that just yet? So focusing on the ecosystem is the second big thing you have to think about while future-proofing. The third is alignment. Now, there are about 150,000 articles on business IT alignment. Some of them are really opaque and crazy. Some of them are okay. But what we say is this. Essentially, we're talking about 7 things. Okay? We're talking about, at the very bottom, the technology. Then the others are split into 2 groups. Green, business, blue, IT. The organizational functions are the things people do, right? Obviously, technology has to support that. They, in turn, have to support some critical building blocks or capabilities, right, that an institution has to have. For example, when we did some research on CBE, right, the capability of teaching and learning management was blowing up. Someone said to me, teaching CBE was like taking everything you know about education and putting it in a blender. Okay? It was, your capability had to change. You had to do something different, okay? So we like, make sure your capabilities are there. They in turn are aligned to the organizational goals. On the right, the IT requirements, which we've all seen in hundreds of RFPs, you know, the user shall, the system shall, et cetera. The principles that I mentioned earlier, and we'll see more of those in a minute, and the IT goals. I have read about 500 IT plans and strategic plans, and 5 of them, the horizontal line is there. The IT plan has nothing to do with the strategic plan, right? Strategic goal says, strategic goal 1, increase the brand of universities. Strategic goal 2, increase enrollment, increase partnership, like, fine, awesome. IT goal 1, improve network infrastructure. Right? Number 2 is like, swap out and get a new ERP or something like that. You're like, how did you get there? Okay, so we are working with institutions to have them intentionally think about this in terms of selection, in terms of rationalization. Like my current system, what do I retire? What do I add, if anything? To kind of think through the alignment. So third is kind of think about how technology fits into this larger sphere, how it relates to institutional goals, your capabilities, and IT goals. I mentioned that we talked to an institution. This is what we did. We looked at a bunch of their capabilities, and we looked at them in 3 ways. So we first said, how efficient are the functions underneath that? How well are people doing their actual jobs? Then we said, how well does technology actually support it? And then the last was, how does it really make use of the data? Okay? And this particular institution, the vast majority of the problem with the ones at the very top, at the very bottom, that were having the problems, is a lot of that data was manual. Input was manual, extraction was manual, reporting was manual. They had staff members whose sole responsibility was data input, okay? Right? That's not terribly efficient, right? They also had some problems around reporting. None of their systems provided adequate reporting, so everyone had to pull data out, put it in Excel, or maybe put it in Tableau, and then display it. Somewhat time consuming. But we looked at them and we said, okay, you still have a way to go, and what we will do with this institution is to say, okay, which of these are the most critical for you? And now let's think about technology, how it moves that, right? So essentially you will have this complete, both functional efficiency, strategic use of data, and technological support. I mentioned the principles. I'm going to take a moment on this. These often exist in someone's head. When you go to an IT shop, someone will say, well, I want to control all IT responsibility. I want to have all IT principles. Everything has to be mine. But usually you have to tease them out. So I got 5 here. The first one I mentioned, enterprise asset. What does that entail? Well, it entails knowing where the data is. It entails understanding what the data is. It also entails a culture shift, which means if I'm in a room typing away and I decide to delete data, I've got to think about how it impacts all of you, right? We have seen that happen before where someone decided they would no longer keep data and it just had a ripple effect across the institution, okay? Because you have to think about, you have to move from ownership of data to stewardship of data. I'm just holding the data. I don't own it. Another is reuse, common use. I had a CIO tell me that the second thing he asked for after whether the solution was going to do its job was whether it can do another job. It was the second highest criterion for him. Reusability, common use applications, is something that you have to think about, perhaps, when you're thinking through this. Technological diversity is one that everyone goes, yes, absolutely, but they don't really understand what that means. What I mean is, it means you don't have that spaghetti chart at the beginning. You have to think about, well, don't add for addition's sake, and also what policies and standards do I have to have in place there, while also ensuring that my solutions remain flexible over time. We've seen this a lot. You'll get a call from someone higher up and says, hey, can you make this change, or can you develop this report, or can you build this connection between this solution and that solution? You're like, well, it's not a requirement, right? There's no enterprise requirement that suits that, just someone wants it to happen, right? Implementing this one is one where someone says, no, does it further the university? If not doing it. And the last is everything we do in terms of buying solutions, retiring solutions, has to serve as maximum benefit to the institution. The reason why I call these out is, as you can certainly see, they're not all IT. These are policy discussions. These discussions that have to happen across the enterprise. You have to have beyond IT. The omission of this really means that sometimes technology decisions happen willy-nilly without any real kind of governance or based on very specific request by this department or this department. So we encourage institutions as part of their work to kind of think about what these principles are. What should they be? How will they get executive buy-in? And we tell presidents as well, like, you have to do this. You have to sign off on this and support it. It's not going to be something that someone just does, okay? So these are the things that we're thinking about, the kind of, in terms of the solution space around thinking about alignment, thinking about ecosystem, kind of addressing principles. These are the things that we're thinking about and we're talking to institutions about and to vendors. And to be fair, some vendors don't care much about this, right? Some vendors say, well, the phone model works well for me, right? My sales are doing well, that's fine. But other vendors say, well, actually, no, right? Because we live in this world. We live in the world where we want to work with institutions, grow, develop, mature over time, as opposed to trying to solve specific pain points. So in the last few minutes, here's my information here, if anyone wants it. So we've got just about 11 minutes. Any questions or comments or thoughts that you had based on what I've presented so far today?
Hi. I have a question. So I'm just curious, and again, thank you so much for this great presentation and sharing your experience. It's wonderful to have you back at Lehman College. So I'm wondering, as you have had this journey, from the Bronx up to the world and then kind of back again, and you are working for, a company that essentially supports higher education. I'm wondering how, what would you share with the community? I mean, you have, a group of people who is working with students on a daily basis. What advice would you give to us, and what could you leave us with as we help, the next generation and the future generations to be successful?
Sure. I mean,
thank you.
The first thing about my path is, Gary can attest, nothing about it makes sense, right? So I was a high school dropout. I went back to high school. Then I went to Bronx Community College, then Lehman, and where I studied ancient philosophy and classics. Cambridge the same, Paris, I switched to sociology because why not? And then back to Cambridge to do some more philosophy, then now I do tech. So there's not a single thread. So one thing I tell my son is, yeah, you can choose whatever you want to do right now in college, kid. You can change your mind later. But I think one of the reasons why I got pulled into tech is because I believe in education as a civil right. And I think this is one of the big levers. And what I despair of is when technology staff, because of the wear and tear of just the daily, are you kidding me moments, lose sight of that. That you are a lever just like teaching and learning is, right? You can do this, you can think through this, you can support this. That's why I'm brought to tech, to answer the question specifically. There's nothing about programming that attracted me. I can do it, I just don't like it. There's nothing particularly about discussing APIs and integration patterns. That's just boring, but I can do it. But really, it's about how can tech support others to move the needle? How can it capture, visualize, display data to stakeholders, including students? How can it truly deliver on the promises of an institution, lifelong learning, student-centeredness? How can it actually do that is something that I get a little bit kind of misty about, but that's the reason why I'm doing it.
So I'm sure because you've gone to both BCC and Lehman, you know a little bit about the ecosystem in which we work.
Yes,
and
I do,
how it's very complex, and so often there are decisions made at the CUNY level that impact the campuses. I'm wondering how you counsel people that you work with about working within those constraints. So when there are decisions made at another level that you don't have control over. So for example, we don't have a universal portfolio system for all of the campuses. Each campus is doing their own thing. We have other systems that are universal, like Blackboard or the CUNY First system. And so in some ways, at the various campuses, we've duplicated efforts. We're using different systems, or people are building their own. In other ways, we're using the same systems. And so I'm just wondering what your thoughts are and any advice and working in a larger system that.
Sure, there's a couple of things I think I would say. One is, you know, I dealt with this like last year with a system, right? Is trying to find a champion at the higher level. Someone's going to listen. That's there. The second thing I think, and I know I have been guilty of this in the past, is not really doing a terribly good job of explaining the business value of tech decisions, right? So when you go to a conference or you talk to someone about standards-based integration, and they'll talk to you, even IMS Global and those do a very poor job of this. It's just, well, you can integrate this and this and this and this. And I'm like, well, that's not really a business value, right? Integration is like plumbing, and you can integrate a lot of things. I wouldn't want to integrate my bathroom to my sink in the kitchen, right? I wouldn't want to do that, right? I have to think more strategically, and what's the value of that? Now, it might just be something simple as time saved, cost reduced, something like that. But I try to enable that person at the higher level. Empower that person to speak to someone else, not tech, and explain this is why this is important, right? It's not just important because it's ugly, right? It's important because it's inefficient right now. It's important because it's not helping us understand where students are, things like that. So find someone to talk to and then try to explain the business value of it.
Thank you. Great presentation for the most part.
Thank you.
You made a great takeaway about adding stewardship in tech, and speaking to a lot of design thinkers around my realm in brainstorming, I do completely agree that we need a more moral objective when building these innovative solutions in the classroom. With that said, how can you provide a peace of mind to teachers who believe that automation may be taking their job? I'm constantly having these conversations with them, with the 2 educational startups that me and my co-founder are having, and we try our best to provide that peace of mind to let them know that we are heading to singularity. However, we believe that we will use technology for our best moral use while repurposing positions to provide more interaction in the classroom. So with that said, how can you shed more light on the stewardship in technology? And
yeah, it's funny. I mean, it was like, you know, teaching on horses, right? So I have to fear a car. I think for me, it's really about, well, the automation is going to take up the repeatable and mundane. It's not going to really take up pedagogy, right? It's going to take up, you know, when we talked about advising solutions, which is what we hear. Some advisors in higher ed will go, no, I just keep it all in my head, right? That's what I want to do. You're like, no. Imagine if you had all your students' data at your fingertips, and you can dive into it. Then you can provide more value to that student because you're not chasing down the data, you're not preparing it, et cetera. So it's really automation, in many cases, will actually yield more value if someone realizes that the mundane and repeatable is now off her plate.
That makes more sense.
So that's the way I usually talk about it.
Thank you.
I know I'm keeping you all from the networking. Don't want to go on too much. Well, thank you very much, everyone.